free report.
Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues now. And make sure to stay tuned to catch me, Mike Gallagher, coming up at 9, only on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Sean from Elmwood Park in for Amy this morning. And at the outset of the Trump administration, there was a lot of comparisons to Reagan, particularly as he was putting his cabinet together, which, frankly, rivals Reagan's in terms of its conservative quotient, probably more conservative. But there was a suggestion that maybe it would be a presidential troika that rode point in the White House the way that it did for Reagan, with Howard Baker as chief of staff and Michael Deaver and Ed Meese. And the three here being Bannon, Priebus, and Conway. Well, that hasn't worked out that way. 6 months in, and it really never materialized as advertised by some. And so what is the role of the chief of staff, particularly in this unique president and this unique presidency? And do we have historical context where we can suggest approaches that work and don't work, Twitter or no Twitter? For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Chris Whipple, who is an Emmy-winning producer for 60 Minutes and the author of The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So, kind of if you were advising General Kelly from your historical perspective, examining chiefs of staff from a bygone era, I'm not saying that General Kelly hasn't done similarly, but what would you say are best practices, almost regardless of the president, for the sake of argument?
Well, back in December, I wrote an epilogue for my book, The Gatekeepers, in which I said if Donald Trump does not empower a White House chief of staff as first among equals to execute his agenda and to tell him what he does not want to hear, then he has no chance at governing. I mean, this is a guy who, had no experience whatsoever with government, and who for the first 6 months thought he could run the White House the way he ran his family real estate empire, and it was a disaster. I mean, this White House is completely broken. And I guess what I would say to Kelly is that he has to, the big question is, will he be empowered with the authority that Priebus never had? And will everyone report through him to Donald Trump? Look, family is another thing. Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner can go directly, but he's got to have authority over the West Wing, and he's got to tell Donald Trump hard truths, and that's going to be the toughest part.
I have a question for you.
You have to put your mic on. Ask it.
Yeah, well, the kid is supposed to put the mic on. But I have a question for you, Chris. And by the way, I'm familiar with a lot of your work. I like it very much. But I do have a question for you. I felt the same way with Barack Obama. And what sickened me is when he brought in Bill Daley and Rahm Emanuel from the Chicago sewer. And we were supposed to pretend that was going to be good. And being from Chicago, we kind of have a knowledge of what that means. So I'd like to think you were not attaching your opinion of Obama on these two scoundrels, were you?
Now, look, I got to disagree with you about Obama. I mean, I think Rahm was a pretty effective chief at the beginning, and I think Rahm was a guy who was not shy about telling Obama exactly what he thought. He was a guy who knew Capitol Hill and got a lot of stuff done, including the stimulus package. Obama needed to get a lot of stuff done. Daley, not so much. I think Bill Daley had a tougher time. He was he never really hit it off with Obama, and he had real friction with everybody else in the West Wing. So that was tough. But
so you think the stimulus package was a good thing?
Well, it's not about good or bad. It's about are you getting the president's agenda done? Oh. And to your point, Chris, Rahm, I call him Tiny Dancer. Rahm also persuaded the president not to pursue path to citizenship, the immigration reform that he campaigned on too. So I mean, he had real sway, and the president took his advice and counsel clearly.
Look, think about this. Ronald Reagan was hell-bent on pursuing Social Security reform as the first thing right out of the gates. Jim Baker, his White House chief, was savvy enough to know, as he put it, that that's the third rail of American politics. You touch it, you get electrocuted. He went to Reagan, turned him around on that. Reagan decided to go with tax cuts on the economy, and the rest is history. Now, imagine if Priebus, on day one, had told Donald Trump, forget about these ridiculous executive orders on immigration. You need to go sit down with Chuck Schumer and do an infrastructure deal that the Democrats will not be able to say no to. This might have been a very different presidency.
Well, and it's interesting you suggest bipartisanship out of the chute, because that's, I guess, where General Kelly is trying to go this week with a report out that he is visiting with top Democrats to try and, I don't know, recast the president's agenda and enlist their open-mindedness.
6 months. That's the problem. I mean, this is a White House that is really broken, and at the very top, you've got a president who is completely undisciplined and unable to think before tweeting. And so you've got a really difficult job. And if I were Kelly, I'd be drawing a few red lines. I think I would be saying, look, if you're not going to give me prior approval on your tweets, which may be impossible, then you should know that the first time you tweet something that's a demonstrable lie, I will resign, and you'll be looking for Chief of Staff number 3.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, though, about the chaos in the White House, and I understand the point you're making, but you still have majorities in both chambers, and you still have the President of the United States, and you still have broad agreement on things like pursuing tax reform. And you even had Paul Ryan saying before last week's chaos that they seem to have a framework for tax reform that's agreed to in principle in the House. So the Democrats can't overplay.
We've heard a lot of this.
Yes, yeah, but the Democrats can't overplay the low pair that they're holding either. They've got their own internal struggles, and they're the minority party.
I'm not here to tell you that the Democrats have their act together here. What I'm here to tell you is that based on talking to all 17 living White House chiefs and looking at the history of the presidency over the last 50 years, this is far and away the most dysfunctional White House in history. Yeah. And it's a huge challenge for anybody to put it together.
Well, that is the right adjective for the challenge, huge. So let me ask you this, though. Is the problem, it seems to me, from the outside looking in, you know better, particularly talking to all the chiefs that you talk to, is before Kelly, you had, it's kind of like nobody had responsibility, and so nobody really had authority. It's just kind of everybody doing their own thing and trying to advance what they think is right while running into conflict with everybody else, or at least, the kind of the half a dozen or so senior people trying to do the same. And you see this even with messaging, where before the mooch was relieved, he and Sarah Huckabee Sanders disagreeing on whether publicly on whether the president was going to sign the Russian sanctions bill or not.
Exactly. I mean, you had absolute unshirted chaos. And, this is a White House that has not been able to do anything right. It can't issue executive orders that are enforceable. It can't pass legislation. It can't prioritize the president's agenda. It can't get anybody on the same page. And, for us to expect that all to suddenly change because you've got a general in there is naive. I mean, the last general to be White House chief was Al Haig under Jerry Ford.
He's in charge.
After Nixon resigned, and he lasted a little more than a month.
Well, I like a general because one of my favorite movies is Moon Over Parador, and I find the similarities are astonishing. But in your opinion, who were the best duo?
James Baker, without question, was right at the top under Ronald Reagan. I got to put Leon Panetta right up there with him in the same company. Two other really good ones were, believe it or not, Dick Cheney, 34-year-old Dick Cheney under Gerald Ford. There's a great story in the book about how, Cheney back in those days was the toast of the town. He was the most popular guy in the city. Those guys, I think Baker and Panetta were the best, and one of the reasons was because they were grounded. They had been around the block. They were not just guys who barked out orders. They were smooth operators. Panetta was described as a guy with an iron fist inside a velvet glove. You have to be able to motivate your troops. You have to be able to speak hard truths to the president. It's exponentially more difficult than anything Kelly has done so far.
And it seems to me it's one of those things, though. Here's the fundamental problem, and this may be the fundamental problem for Kelly too, is you just can't work around the principle. Not at this level. You need buy-in from the principal, and to some extent, I wonder if there are lessons to be learned from Hamilton Jordan and Jimmy Carter, because it seemed to me that Hamilton Jordan was a sharp guy, a capable guy, a likable guy. This is just from reading some of his works before he passed away and trying and understanding a little bit about the Carter administration. But he couldn't get past the principle.
No, but the other thing is that Ham Jordan never wanted. It's a long story, which I tell in the book. But Jordan never wanted to be chief of staff in the first place and was never suited for it. He was a brilliant political strategist. He should have been Jimmy Carter's Karl Rove, but not the guy who was trying to make the trains run.
Yeah,
the thing that's important here is that Jimmy Carter, it took him 2.5 years to realize that he had to have a functioning chief of staff. It took Bill Clinton 1.5 years to figure out that he needed to really empower a White House chief in the form of Leon Panetta. So, look, is there hope? Yeah. But, as I say, there's never been a White House this dysfunctional 6 months in, and there's no evidence so far that Trump has learned anything about how to govern.
All right, we shall see what General Kelly is able to effect. He is Chris Whipple, Emmy-winning producer for 60 Minutes, the author of The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
Before you see it on